The courtroom fell silent, every breath suspended, as Kash Patel stood unwavering under the weight of a $500 million fine. Judge Caprio, known for his warm wisdom and fairness, had just delivered the harshest sentence in his decades on the bench. But what happened next, no one expected. Kash slowly raised her hand, not in protest, but to speak. What she said caused the seasoned judge to tremble. Her words pierced deeper than any legal argument. Documents slid across the bench, hands shook, and for the first time in his courtroom, Judge Caprio's voice cracked as he whispered, "I didn't know." This is the story of how justice collided with compassion, and how the truth turned the gavel on its head. Comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest stories from the courtroom. Kash Patel entered the courtroom just after 9 a.m., quietly and deliberately. She moved with the composed gait of someone long accustomed to scrutiny, yet carrying the weary stiffness of a soul weathered by public storms. Her attire was modest, a navy blazer crisply pressed but frayed at the cuffs, charcoal slacks a shade too faded, and low-heeled black shoes that had clearly seen more miles on pavement than polished floors. A plain scarf wrapped neatly around her head, concealing her once signature cascade of jet-black curls. In her hand, she clutched a thick manila folder, edges curled and corners bent, as if it had been leafed through too many times during too many sleepless nights. There was a brief pause in the courtroom as she took her seat at the defendant's table. The audience, packed tighter than usual, fell into a murmuring hush. At first glance, many didn't register the woman before them. But then, recognition crept in. Whispers sparked like brushfire. "Is that Kash Patel? Wasn't she on CNN during the Global Climate Summit? I thought she was living in Geneva now." Once, Kash Patel's name had flashed across headlines and press releases. As a former lead advisor to global tech coalitions and founder of the NGO BridgeBright, she had been celebrated for her groundbreaking work connecting digital infrastructure with humanitarian aid. Her voice had echoed through the halls of the United Nations, and her policy briefs had influenced 5 countries' disaster response systems. She had been quoted in The Economist, profiled in Wired, and lauded at Davos. But this morning, she wasn't a panelist or a keynote speaker. She wasn't here to present data or advocate innovation. She was here as a defendant. The charge: misappropriation of international disaster relief funds on an unprecedented scale. The prosecution alleged that BridgeBright had funneled nearly $500 million, meant for earthquake-stricken regions of Southeast Asia, into offshore ventures linked to Kash's former colleagues in Silicon Valley. A complex web of shell companies, blockchain obfuscation, and ill-timed corporate mergers stood at the heart of the case. To the world outside, the name BridgeBright had once symbolized transparency, innovation, and relief. But now, it had become a lightning rod for suspicion. Reports varied wildly. Some insisted Kash was the mastermind behind a global tech money laundering scheme, while others claimed she was a scapegoat, caught between bureaucratic inefficiency and geopolitical vendettas. Inside the courtroom, however, speculation had no place. Only facts, arguments, and evidence would matter. Behind the elevated bench, Judge Frank Caprio studied the thick case file with a practiced eye. The room quieted further as he lifted his gaze toward the defendant, brow furrowed, but not unkind. "Ms. Patel," he began, his voice a gentle baritone with just the right trace of New England warmth. "Looks like you've been busy." A ripple of laughter flickered through the room, soft, surprised, unsure. Even Kash allowed herself a tiny, ironic smile. She tucked the folder neatly in front of her and responded without missing a beat. "Only trying to stay useful, Your Honor." It was a short exchange, civil, lightly humorous, but it revealed just enough. This wasn't going to be a cut-and-dried trial. Not with a defendant as complex as Kash Patel. Not with stakes this high. In the gallery, a woman in a tailored green coat took notes furiously. Next to her, a man in a faded press badge whispered into a recorder. 2 rows back, a young activist live-streamed the proceedings with trembling hands. The courtroom had seen its share of parking violations and petty thefts. But this was different. The stage was set, and none present could guess how deep the rabbit hole would go. Judge Frank Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers interlaced, the thick file before him resembling a miniature brick of paper and burden. His eyes, however, remained steady, measured. He had seen decades of courtroom drama unfold before him. Tears, lies, apologies, and occasional redemption. But this case was different. It wasn't just about money, it was about trust, betrayed or misunderstood. Kash Patel, he said, enunciating every syllable with quiet authority. You're charged with orchestrating the redirection of $500 million, money meant for communities devastated by natural disasters. How do you plead? Kash didn't flinch. Her voice was even, calm, almost rehearsed, but not robotic. Not guilty, Your Honor. There was no dramatic gasp, but a palpable tension rippled through the room. Cameras clicked quietly from the press bench. An assistant for the prosecution passed a thick binder to their lead attorney, a polished woman in a navy pantsuit with a tone that exuded confidence, almost bordering on contempt. Your Honor, the prosecution will demonstrate that Ms. Patel willfully diverted critical aid funds into a network of shell companies whose ownership traces directly back to former business partners of hers from the tech world. We'll show transaction records, encrypted emails, internal memos, and sworn testimonies from BridgeBright board members who either resigned in protest or were deliberately kept in the dark. She motioned to the large monitor beside the jury box. It flickered to life, revealing a series of slides, flowcharts, timelines, and digital receipts. Red arrows pointed like accusations, tracing a trail from donor wire transfers through layered intermediaries in Singapore and Switzerland, all the way to startup seed accounts in Palo Alto and Menlo Park. Names of corporations no one had ever heard of, at least not until now, filled the screen. The amounts attached were staggering. $15 million to Norvant Labs, the prosecutor stated, filed under Rapid Housing Prototyping. $12.7 million to Glowserve International, marked as Sanitation Tech Research, yet the company was dissolved 6 months later. $20 million to Elaracor, a drone delivery firm co-founded by Ms. Patel's former fiancé. All eyes returned to Kash, who remained still, unapologetic, but not smug. Judge Caprio tapped the edge of the financial logs, thick with signatures and approval stamps. Ms. Patel, these wire transfers were made with your executive credentials. Your login timestamps are here. Your email approval is here. Are you denying you authorized them? She shook her head gently. No, Your Honor. I did authorize the transfers, but I reject the prosecution's interpretation of them. There was a noticeable shift in the air. The spectators leaned forward. Even the stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Caprio arched an eyebrow. You're telling me this isn't embezzlement? I'm telling you, Kash said, carefully choosing her words, that this is the consequence of trying to save lives in a way the law hasn't caught up with. It wasn't defiance, it was conviction. And her voice, though soft, rang with something dangerous, nuance. The judge didn't speak. He merely gestured with his hand. Go on. Kash drew in a breath. BridgeBright was founded to deliver aid where bureaucracy failed, and in the aftermath of the 9.6 quake in Alpania, we found ourselves paralyzed. Relief containers sat in docks for weeks. Supply trucks were hijacked. Local officials siphoned off food. I was faced with an impossible choice: follow every regulation to the letter, or do what I believed would actually help people survive. "So you sent the money to your friends?" the prosecutor cut in, tone barbed. "Not aid workers, not international NGOs, but Silicon Valley startups." "To innovators," Kash corrected, "to those who could deploy portable housing drones, solar water purification systems, modular field hospitals." Within 72 hours, the first mobile medpod was on the ground in Alpania. We didn't wait for permission. We didn't wait for paperwork. The prosecutor turned to Judge Caprio with an incredulous expression. "With all due respect, Your Honor, what she's describing isn't heroism, it's vigilantism. She had no authority to repurpose funds beyond their stipulated use. There are treaties, audit requirements." "Authority, no," Kash interrupted, her voice lower now. "But necessity?" "Yes." That word, necessity, hung in the air like the toll of a bell. Her voice trembled, just slightly, the first break in the armor. "I was on the ground, Your Honor. I saw children drinking from algae-infested rivers. I saw amputations done with rusted tools. And I knew we had the means, the tech, the teams, the funding, to fix it. But not if we waited for outdated procurement forms and corrupt gatekeepers." A silence settled that felt too large for the room. Even the prosecutor said nothing. Caprio didn't interrupt. He just studied her, as if trying to read the space between her sentences. Kash glanced at the monitor, at the arrows and figures now painting her as a thief. "These charts show where the money went," she said, "but not what it accomplished." Her voice cracked, barely, but it did. "And no one's asking how many lives it saved." The courtroom was still recovering from the shockwaves of Kash Patel's testimony when the prosecution stood again, their eyes glinting with the sharpness of a hidden card finally ready to be played. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor said, her voice cool, deliberate, "the state calls a surprise witness, Mr. Eric Drennan, former lead financial auditor for Bridgebright." A murmur rustled through the gallery as a man in a gray suit approached the stand. He was clean-shaven, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of demeanor that signaled strict order over sentiment. He took his oath with mechanical precision and settled into the witness chair with the poise of someone long prepared for this moment. His testimony began clinically, listing off what he described as red flags, mismatched dates on wire transfers, undocumented executive meetings, and inconsistent paper trails between regional Bridgebright branches. He spoke with the detached calm of a surgeon describing an amputation. There were entries logged from IP addresses in Jakarta, hours before the corresponding board approvals were signed in Geneva, he noted. Transaction timestamps showed approvals at 3 a.m. local time. Some shell accounts were created within days of major donations clearing, and all of them tied to ventures with no prior humanitarian record. The prosecution nodded, satisfied, but Judge Caprio's expression remained unreadable. He turned to Kash, now seated at the defense table. "Ms. Patel, would you like to respond?" Kash stood slowly and turned not to the witness, but to the judge. "May I offer context before I respond, Your Honor?" Caprio hesitated just a beat, then nodded. "Go ahead." Kash reached into the thick folder she had carried in. This time, not for legal documents or transaction sheets, but a letter. She unfolded it carefully, hands trembling ever so slightly. "This," she said, her voice growing softer, "is a letter from Marisol Reyes. She's 11 years old, a survivor of the 2023 Haiti quake. Her mother died in the rubble of a collapsed school. Food and medical aid were delayed for weeks. But because of the clean water systems funded through our rerouted capital, she lived." She handed the letter to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Caprio. Then Cash lifted a photograph from the folder and held it high. In the photo, a young girl with sun-warmed skin and bright eyes smiled proudly, standing on one leg. The other was a prosthetic, simple, makeshift, but emblazoned with the Bridge-Bright logo. The room grew so quiet, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights could be heard above. "She didn't care where the money came from," Cash said. "Only that the water didn't kill her." She pulled more letters from the folder. One from a teenage boy in Kenya who survived a cholera outbreak thanks to a solar sanitation hub. One from a Syrian nurse who used a mobile clinic designed by a startup the prosecution had just condemned to treat hundreds displaced by bombing. One from a mother in rural India whose newborn was delivered safely in a modular maternity pod. "These aren't statistics," Cash said. "They're lives. And these letters? They're the audits I cared about." Finally, she withdrew a battered, torn ledger. Its pages were yellowed, corners frayed. She laid it gently on the evidence table. "This," she said, her voice catching, "belonged to my brother. He built the donation algorithm we use to track real-time aid needs. He worked from the field, not from a boardroom." She looked down at it as though it still carried his breath. "He died of dengue fever in a relief zone in northern Laos. The medicine was held up in customs. Bureaucracy killed him, not the virus." She looked up, eyes glistening. "Since that day, I swore no one else would die waiting for permission." The silence was absolute. Judge Caprio remained perfectly still, his fingers no longer interlaced, but gently resting on the photo of Marisol. Across the room, a member of the jury wiped away a tear. Even the hardline prosecutor, who moments ago had stood poised like a hawk, now looked away, her gaze lowered, her arguments momentarily quieted. No one said a word, because in that moment, evidence gave way to something far more persuasive: the cost of compassion and the blurred line between protocol and purpose. And the courtroom understood. This case wasn't just about money. It was about whether doing good in the wrong way was better than doing nothing the right way. Judge Frank Caprio closed the thick folder slowly, deliberately. The sound of the final page sliding into place echoed softly through the silent courtroom. He folded his hands, took a deep breath, and then exhaled with the weight of a man who had spent decades carrying the stories of others. His gaze lifted to Kash Patel, still standing beside the defense table, surrounded not by legal allies, but by letters from children, photos of survivors, and a battered ledger that had turned a sterile financial trial into something deeply human. Then, his eyes turned to the jury, the press, and the scattered members of the public who had filled the gallery in curiosity, but now sat gripped by something deeper. "This courtroom," Caprio began, his voice softer now, rich with introspection, "has heard thousands of cases over the years: petty thefts, broken promises, deceptions born of greed, and actions born of desperation. But this," he motioned gently toward Cash, "yours blurs the lines." He paused, not for effect, but because the words ahead demanded care. "You broke laws, yet saved lives." A stir moved through the room again. Some nodded, some bristled, but all listened. "There are those who would say justice must be blind," he continued, "that law must be absolute, that we cannot build a just world if we allow exceptions. But today, I find myself asking, what happens when following the law means letting people die? When bureaucracy becomes a barrier between a beating heart and the help it needs?" He turned his eyes briefly to the photo of Marisol, the girl with the prosthetic leg and the radiant, unshakable smile. "Is it better," he asked the room, "to follow the rules or to follow righteousness?" Silence answered, but it was not empty. It was alive with conflict. "And when the two collide," Caprio continued, "where does mercy fit?" He let the question sit. He could feel it, the weight it carried, the way it tilted the floor beneath everyone's feet. $500 million, he said, more quietly now. That's no small figure. That's a staggering responsibility. You made decisions that bypassed oversight, that sidestepped checks and balances. You redefined what aid looked like, without approval, without consensus. He looked Kash in the eye. Some would call that arrogance. Then he looked back at the jury. Others might call it a higher calling. Caprio stepped down from his seat and began to pace slowly, not theatrically, but thoughtfully, as if walking through the dense forest of the moral questions now surrounding the case. I've seen cases where people took from others because they thought they deserved more. You didn't do that. You took from the system, from its rigidity, from its delay, and you funneled it into something more immediate, more human. But does that make it right? He turned, hands behind his back. People think justice is black and white. You're guilty or you're not. You're a hero or you're a thief. But real life isn't written in ink. It's smudged in gray. His voice caught just slightly, a brief crack that revealed how deeply this moment had reached into him. And somewhere between scandal and sacrifice, he gestured to the ledger, to the letters, to Kash herself, is where we stand today. The courtroom remained still. Even the walls seemed to lean in. Caprio returned to his bench and took his seat slowly. He folded his hands again and looked down, not at the documents, not at the evidence, but at nothing. He was no longer weighing laws. He was weighing a soul, and perhaps his own. This isn't an easy judgment, he said, because this case isn't just about numbers. It's about consequences, intent, humanity, and the question we rarely ask in courts of law. Did it help? He looked up, voice firm again, but not cold. Justice must uphold order, but it must never lose sight of compassion, and if there's a place where the two must wrestle, let it be here, in this room, with eyes open and hearts engaged. The moral weight of his reflection hung in the air like incense, somber, sacred, unforgettable. No one spoke. No one dared. Because every person in that courtroom now understood. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. Just as the courtroom began to settle into a pensive stillness, Judge Caprio's words still reverberating in the silence, the double doors at the rear of the room creaked open. Heads turned. Two individuals in navy blue suits stepped inside, flanking a third figure, a composed woman in her mid-40s, with silver pins on her lapel that bore the unmistakable insignia of the United Nations. The murmur that rippled through the gallery was immediate. Journalists stirred. A juror's pen froze mid-note. The lead official stepped forward with measured authority. "Permission to approach the bench, Your Honor." Judge Caprio looked up, visibly surprised. He exchanged a brief glance with the bailiff, who nodded after verifying the visitor's credentials. "You may proceed," Caprio said, voice cautious but curious. The woman stepped forward and presented a large sealed folder. Its dark blue cover bore the emblem of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNOCHA. Caprio opened the folder slowly. Inside, he found a thick stack of documents bound with gold-threaded corners and stamped with international seals. The official spoke clearly so all could hear. "We bring forward official recognition from the United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Council, Your Honor. These documents pertain to the practices pioneered by Bridgebright under Ms. Patel's leadership." Caprio flipped through the documents, his expression gradually shifting from stoic neutrality to visible astonishment. The first page bore a statement from the Office of Global Humanitarian Innovation. "The Patel Protocols, a new model for emergency decentralized relief." The next, commendations from 10 national governments, including Chile, Indonesia, Kenya, and Syria, formally acknowledging the success of the systems Kash helped implement. Another page included a signed declaration from a multinational coalition of aid organizations. Their words were unequivocal. BridgeBright's model, once controversial, is now the cornerstone of the 2025 UN Tech Forward Relief Directive. The official clarified, "For the past year, the United Nations has been conducting a quiet review of BridgeBright's operations. That review concluded last week. Ms. Patel's methods have not only been validated, they are now recommended international best practices for circumventing logistical and political blockades in crisis zones." Gasps echoed across the gallery. Even the jury exchanged stunned glances. The prosecutor leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the documents, as if searching for a loophole that no longer existed. Judge Caprio blinked, adjusting his reading glasses. Then, with the room waiting on his every word, he read aloud from the final page. "In absence of protocol, Ms. Patel innovated. In absence of clarity, she acted. Her approach was not exploitation, but evolution. We now understand her methods were not fraud, but foresight." Kash stood still, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she heard the words. Her face betrayed no pride, only a cautious, wounded relief. It was as if she'd carried the weight of a silent truth for years, and only now, at the very edge of conviction, had the world caught up to her. The UN official concluded with a final statement. "This court should be aware that Ms. Patel has been offered an advisory seat on the new Global Humanitarian Technology Council, pending the outcome of this trial, of course." Even the court reporter, diligently typing away for the past 30 minutes, hesitated with the keys. Caprio placed the documents gently on the bench, his hands resting on top of them. He took a breath. Deep, long, heavy. "So," he said finally, "the world has made up its mind." Then he looked at Kash. "And now, it's my turn." There was no anger in his tone, no triumph, just the heavy burden of knowing that what began as a criminal case had transformed into something far greater, a moral reckoning, a systemic critique, and now, an international turning point. He turned back to the courtroom, his voice now lower but still firm. "We don't often get moments like this, moments where we see, not just whether someone broke the law, but whether the law itself failed to serve the people it was meant to protect." The words hung in the air like scripture. Behind him, the official documents lay open on the bench, proof not only of vindication, but of something rarer: legacy. Judge Caprio sat motionless for a moment, hands gently folded, his gaze steady on Kash Patel. But behind that stillness, something deeper stirred. An ache, perhaps, that comes only from years of weighing right and wrong against the unpredictable tide of human experience. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was soft, almost fragile. "You could have said all this earlier," he said. "You could have shown the world the commendations, the proof. You could have saved yourself a great deal of pain." Kash didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, eyes calm but tired. "I tried," she said. "At first. But all they saw was a woman with access, with power, with a past. They wouldn't have believed my intent, but they would believe the outcomes. So I stayed quiet and let the work speak for itself." A hush swept over the room again, and in that stillness, Caprio's face changed. A faint, almost wistful smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You remind me of a woman I sentenced nearly 30 years ago," he said, settling deeper into his chair as memory crept into his voice. "She'd shoplifted baby formula from a grocery store. Single mother, no prior record. Said it was for her newborn." He paused, reflecting. "I fined her $50. told her that while I understood her reasons, the law still had to speak. He looked back at Kash. Years later, I got a letter from her. She'd become a pediatric nurse. Said the day in my courtroom was the turning point. Said it reminded her that someone saw her. Kash's eyes glistened, but she remained composed. I don't know what your turning point was, Caprio continued, but somewhere along the line, you stopped asking what was allowed and started asking what was right. The courtroom, already heavy with emotion, now felt sacred. Jurors blinked back tears. Journalists sat with pens still in hand but unmoving, like they feared breaking the spell. Judge Caprio picked up the gavel, not with the sternness of authority, but with the reverence of closure. This court, he said, recognizes that the financial transfers in question were technically unapproved and therefore fall within the domain of unauthorized fund reallocation under international relief standards. He looked at the prosecutor, who stood still, speechless, defeated not by argument, but by truth. And for that, Caprio continued, a judgment must be recorded. He raised the gavel and gently struck the bench. $500 million fine, he said clearly. Suspended, no further penalties, no criminal record, case dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed not like a command, but like a benediction. The gallery didn't erupt into applause. There was no standing ovation. Only quiet, a reverent, stunned silence from people realizing they had just witnessed justice evolve in real time. Kash lowered her head slightly, more in humility than in relief. And then, the judge did something no one expected. He reached for a tissue and wiped a tear from his cheek. And thank you, he whispered. Thank you for doing what many of us are too afraid to do. Kash didn't speak. She only nodded, her eyes now wet with emotion. She turned and gathered the letters, the photos, and the ledger with trembling hands. In the back of the room, a little girl, Marisol Reyes, now standing on a prosthetic leg, clutched her mother's hand. They had flown in quietly, without notice. But now, their presence shone like a quiet validation of every choice Kash had made. As Kash walked out of the courtroom, the camera lights didn't flash. No reporters swarmed. The moment was too sacred for spectacle. Judge Caprio watched her go, then looked back at the bench, at the documents, and at the empty air where a defendant had stood. A woman painted as a villain, but revealed as something far rarer, a reluctant hero. And in that moment, the law didn't bend. It understood. As Kash Patel exited the courtroom, cameras didn't chase her. No headlines screamed her name. But in the quiet corners of the world, in refugee camps and remote villages, her work continued. Judge Caprio remained seated long after she left, staring not at her file, but at the photo of the little girl from Haiti. That day, justice wasn't blind. It saw pain, risk, and courage, and it responded not with vengeance, but with vision. In a world of protocols, she chose people, and in doing so, she reminded the court, sometimes the greatest acts of justice are not done in the light, but in the shadows, with only conscience as company. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Would you have ruled the same way? Should Kash have obeyed the rules, or did she do the right thing in breaking them? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. These real stories of justice and humanity matter, and we're just getting started. See you in the next case, where truth is tested and hearts are revealed.